Howdy, y'all. Travis here. It's time for another Idiot in the Box. It's been a couple of months. Busy months. A lot of cool books narrated since then, and one in particular, The Razor by J Barton Mitchell. I wrapped up just a couple of weeks ago, and it's coming out, I think, on November 27th from Highbridge. And it's friggin' awesome. It's so good. It was so much fun that I thought I would just read a little excerpt here, for the hell of it. Also, so much fun that I thought I would have a little whiskey before I did. This is a nice Hibiki Harmony. It's a Japanese whiskey, super tasty. If you are a narrator, don't actually do this before narrating. It's a terrible idea, but I've already turned in my pickups, so screw it. Oh, so good. At any rate, the excerpt I'm going to read features my favorite character from the book, Gable, who in any sane universe would be played by Helen Mirren in the movie adaptation. So let's get right into it. Oh, that is good whiskey. 29. Gable. 12 hours earlier, Gable had held Sedona's throat with one hand. In the other, she had nothing. In spite of how they had capped her fingers and all the instruments on the lab table, torch cutters, scalpels, molecular fusers, her palm carried all the threat needed. For the moment. "Gable," John said in the lab outside her polysteel cell, his voice shaky. "Think about this." He was the lone person there now, the last of the science team. The soldiers were in the defense zone, between the two security doors. "John," Gable clucked her tongue, "have you ever known me to do anything that was not thought out?" "Just—" He held up his hands. They shook. His eyes were wide, staring at Sedona in Gable's grip. "Don't hurt her. Don't—" So contemptible. "John," Gable said with forced patience, "listen, please." "Harris?" a voice echoed over the intercom. Rough and stern, older. "Don't listen to one word that bitch says." The other part of the equation, Lieutenant Anderson, the head of her lab's security detail. The alarms had begun almost 5 minutes ago. A specific alarm. 3 short tones, 1 long one. A quarantine lockdown alarm. Gable knew because she listened. She observed. It was amazing what you could pick up once your captors became used to you, once they no longer feared you. They ran drills. They entered and exited doors. They talked and revealed their feelings for each other. Gable filed it all away in anticipation of the moment it could be used. And that moment had come. The soldiers, led by Anderson, were in the defense zone, in between doors 3 and 4. From what Gable had gleaned, in the event of a quarantine lockdown, each lab security detail took positions there, in between the scientists and whatever might have gotten loose in one of the other labs. And it appeared something had indeed gotten loose. "Mute her cell right now," Anderson's voice demanded. He was clearly listening in on their conversation. "Is that what you want to do, John?" Gable asked, turning Sedona's lovely neck just so. "Mute me?" Relationships between co-workers on black sites were strictly forbidden, probably for this exact reason. They kept it secret, John and Sedona, but Gable had deduced it. She had listened and observed. "John," Sedona moaned, her eyes locked on the man on the other side of the polysteel. "Let's try something different," Gable said, her voice a musing tone. "Let's mute Anderson instead." John froze at the directive, staring at her. It was the first realization, Gable knew. Until now, everything had been instinct, primal fear. Now he was coming to understand the reality, that she had the one thing he would do almost anything to protect. "Harris? Harris?" Anderson shouted over the intercom. "You fucking do what I say!" John just stared at Sedona, unsure. "Mute him, John," Gable told him. "Harris!" Anderson yelled. "Whatever the fuck is loose in this place, it is nowhere near as bad as she is." Gable smiled. Anderson was absolutely correct. "Now, John," Gable said softly, "mute him, or I will drain her blood." "Ha!" The lieutenant's voice cut off as John hit a button on the closest computer. Gable smiled, pleased, enjoying the silence. Now they could talk. Now they could bargain. "Okay," John said, holding his hands up. "You got what you wanted." Gable raised an eyebrow. "Did I, John?" "Please," Sedona whispered. Gable could feel her young body shaking. "Do you remember the first time we met, John?" Gable looked down at Sedona. Her perfect skin, her black hair, dark like a raven's feathers. She smelled lovely, even here in this place. "Before you came to know me better, back when you still believed simple pain could get you what you wanted." "Gable, please," John said, taking a step closer, desperately. Were there tears in his eyes? Her free hand slid toward the tray with the medical instruments, the ones they had used on her over and over again. The caps on her fingers scraped against the metal. "Do you remember the laser torch, John?" Gable lifted the instrument up so that John could see. "Jesus," John said, his voice breaking. Sedona tensed, started to squirm. Gable squeezed her neck until she went still again. "I remember it explicitly," Gable said. "All the lovely little sensations." "Please." "Do you remember what I told you then? That one day we would revisit every moment we've spent together?" "Gable." "And you laughed, John. You laughed." She flicked a button on the device in her hand. The laser torch burned to life with a hiss, a little sliver of superheated plasma at its end. "Are you laughing now?" "Gable, please." "Please what, John? Please don't kill her?" The lockdown alarm continued to sound everywhere, and Sedona began to cry in Gable's arms. "Sedona has always been kind to me." Gable pulled her closer, brought the laser torch to where she could see it. "Haven't you, Blossom? While the others cut and burned me, or did their tests to try and figure out how I had made myself into what I am, Sedona fed me. Sedona cleaned me. Sedona bandaged me. And so I am inclined to let her live. But nothing is ever free, John." "What do you want?" "Something very, very simple. I want you to use the security panel. I want you to enter your override code, and I want you to deactivate the internal quarantine lockdown for this lab." John's eyes widened. "What? For God's sake, why?" "Because something interesting has escaped its confinement. I want to see it." The lights in the lab suddenly went dark. Emergency lighting lit up along the floor, painting everything in black and red shadows. Someone had shut down the facility reactor, it seemed. Interesting. New sounds filtered in through the security doors from the hallway outside. Gable could barely hear them over the intercom in her cell. Gunfire. Rapid. Violent. Frantic. "Goodness," Gable breathed. Things were escalating quickly. John could see the implications now. He looked tortured. "If I override the internal lock—" "Yes," Gable agreed sympathetically. "You and the security team will likely die. Whatever is out there, it doesn't seem very friendly, does it?" John looked back at her. "You'll just kill her anyway?" Gable clucked her tongue, pulled Sedona closer. Her scent was truly lovely. "John, you can trust every word I say. Do you know why? Because one of you is going to die here in this lab, her or you. And if it is you, as I'm confident it will be, I will make Sedona watch every second of what is to come. I will pry her eyes open if I must, and she will live with it. see it every time she closes her eyes for the rest of her life. And knowing that, John, makes me feel warm." She let the words sink in, glared hard into John's eyes. "That is how you can trust me, because we've come to know each other so well these last 6 years, haven't we?" John stared back at her, shaking, his eyes moving between Gable and Sedona. "Do we have a deal, then?" Gable asked, bringing the laser torch up to her hostage's neck. Sedona tried to push away, but Gable pulled her close. "Or should I start sculpting her?" "Don't, John," Sedona started, but Gable squeezed her throat shut. John stared back at her through the glass, tortured. "You don't have to say yes, John," Gable said. "I can see the answer in your eyes. Shall we tell the good lieutenant? It's only fair, isn't it? I think it's best if it comes from you. Unmute his channel." "John," Sedona moaned, her voice barely audible. "Now," Gable told him. John's hands moved lifelessly back to the computer, pressed buttons. Immediately, Anderson's grating voice broke in. "Lying! Whatever she's told you, she's—" "Tell him you have no choice, John," Gable said. "Tell him you're sorry." "Harris!" Anderson yelled over the speaker. "You cannot let her loose!" "Tell him," Gable said again. "It will make you feel better." "I'm sorry," John said, his voice monotone, dead. "Harris!" Anderson shouted. John's hands moved to a new set of controls. He looked up at Sedona. "I love you." Sedona struggled. Gable let her. The doors at either end of the lab opened as John entered his override code. New sounds broke the air, almost overpowering the gunfire filtering in from outside. Hissing, scratching, static, and voices. Underneath it all, lovely voices. The sounds, Gable noticed, were somehow coming from her cell's speakers, filling the interior with their music. It gave her chills. "Oh my," she moaned. John moved toward the polysteel between him and Sedona, didn't even look behind him at the open doors. He placed his hand on the wall. Gable let the girl do the same, let their palms mirror each other. It would only make the memories sweeter. Stroboscopic flashes lit everything up. The security detail, Anderson, 4 others, retreated back into the lab, pulse rifles firing. Everything electric in the room suddenly flickered. The lights from the computers and the machines and the tools, they all dimmed as if they were hooked up to the same switch. Only muzzle flashes lit the lab now. Then a surge of blackness exploded inside the room. Gable's eyes let her see far more than ordinary men. She saw the swirls, the formations, the tendrils. She saw it. And she smiled, watching it move, watching it grab and take them, drag them out and back into the hall one at a time, kicking and screaming and dying. John was the last. When he was ripped away, Sedona screamed. When it was all over and done, the scientist sank against the polysteel, fell to the floor with a dazed look, shaking. "Beautiful," Gable whispered, staring after the force that had swept through the room. "And that ought to do it. Badass. Stay happy, folks."